this What the Hell in History video, I'm discussing the tragic fate, but most of all, one of the biggest mysteries of all time. What happened to the princes in the tower? First of all, who were they? The princes in the tower referred to the deposed Edward V of England and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. They were heirs to the throne of King Edward IV of England. The brothers were the only sons of the king by his queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Aged 12 and 9 years old respectively, they were put in the tower by their paternal uncle and England's regent, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. The reason for that was, at first, to tell them that it was to prepare for Edward V's coronation. As it turned out, they never left the Tower of London. Also, it's what we want to believe. Before the young king could be crowned, he and his brother were declared illegitimate, and Richard became King of England. It is very unclear what actually happened to the princes in the tower, but that is why I want to discuss it with you. There are three prominent historians that have been discussing this among themselves. They have had hot debates about it. I'm talking here about Nathen, Amin, Matt Lewis, and Nicola Tallis. And here I'm going to tell you their theories, and at the end of it, when we discuss each theory, I will tell you what I think actually happened. When we think about the death of these two young boys, the first to blame is always Richard III of England. But Richard III of England has a real champion by his side, Matt Lewis. And Matt actually makes very strong, compelling arguments against the fact that Richard had anything to do with the death, or should I say more, the disappearance of his nephews. Matt, Nathen and Nicola have regular debates, either at festivals or in podcasts, and I will link down below where you can join them and listen fully to their compelling arguments. Here I'm just giving you a taster, and I'm telling you what I think of each of their theories. So if we start with Matt, who's a great defender of Richard III, and for that he makes a few convincing points. First of all, when we look at Richard and at his personality and what happened before, the death of his brother, Edward IV, we realize that Richard was actually a very, noble man who had great qualities, who was very loyal, who could show compassion. For Matt, having Richard III as a murderer just doesn't fit the bill, because Richard could have never done something like that when we really look at the man he was. What is true, though, is that we have records of people explaining the disappearance of Edward V and his brother. Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar who visited England in the 1480s and who was in London in the spring and summer of 1583 when the two brothers were put into the tower, recorded that after Richard III seized the throne, Edward and his younger brother, Richard, were taken into the inner apartments of the tower, and they were seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. There are reports of the two princes being seen playing in the tower grounds shortly after Richard joined his brother, but there are no records of them after the summer of 1483. Many historians believe the princes were murdered. It is also important to remember that other than the disappearance, there is no evidence of their murder to this day. We haven't found the remains of the two princes in the tower. And that is why it's one of the greatest historical mysteries of all time. For Matt Lewis, the fact that we are not sure if they were murdered and we only talk about disappearance, Matt Lewis really believes that the two princes actually escaped somehow. Not only escaped, but one of them went to the north and the other one left the country. In his mind, these two princes became the contenders to the throne during Henry VII's reign, so after 1485. 2 years after the reign of Henry VII has started, there was a rebellion against him that tried to put this man, Lambert Simnel, a boy they claimed to be actually the real prince, the real heir to the throne, Edward V of England. The truth is, there is actually no proof that this Lambert was Edward V. Also, why would he have waited such a long time to regain his throne? In 1490, a young Fleming, Perkin Warbeck, appeared and claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, so the second prince in the Tower. He led attempted invasions of Ireland in 1491 and in England in 1495. He gained the support of Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, and of James IV of Scotland. Again, the truth is, the claim that these two men were actually the princes in the Tower could be a real possibility, but at the same time, there is so unknowns about it. Can we just believe that these men waited for so long to do something about their fate? And can we believe that they survived that long, that they managed to flee the Tower, to escape the Tower of London without Richard III knowing that they had fled? And so all of this, for me, this kind of theory works and doesn't work. There are some things that for me are a bit hard to believe, and also it is true, we don't have strong evidence confirming these two men's identity as Edward and Richard, the princes in the Tower. Now let's go to the next theory and how Nicola Tallis defends another historical character who was accused of murdering the two princes. The other big suspect of who had murdered the princes in the Tower is without a doubt Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort is the mother of Henry VII, and so for lots of people it was really clear why she did not want the two princes to survive, especially after 1485. However, Nicola Tallis defends her case in a very as well convincing way. It is important to note that Margaret Beaufort made an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the two princes in the Tower. And here it is very hard to believe that she would have actually killed the sons of the woman she was trying to get an alliance from. Also, again, there is no strong evidence against Margaret Beaufort. I'm not saying here that it is completely, unbelievable, but when you read Uncrowned Queen by Nicola Tallis, you see as well the character of Margaret Beaufort. She's far from being perfect, but I don't think she's a real villain. And I think that we have to be careful of not always, blaming a woman when something happens. It happened with Catherine de Medici later on. It happens, with so many women in history where we tend to blame them for anything that went wrong. And I think it's what here some people are trying to do with Margaret Beaufort. The third theory is by Nathen Amin, who thinks that Richard III is the one who is responsible for the murder of his nephews, Edward and Richard, and, the princes in the Tower. And he obviously goes into what has been believed for so many centuries. He believes that even though Richard III might have been a good man before, might have shown very good qualities, that when it came to power, when it came to legitimize his power, he had no other choice but to get rid of his two nephews. And even with that, I do have a problem, but I see what Nathen Amin is doing. It is the most plausible theory, because we don't have that many evidence, so who else would have done it? However, I think it's more likely that the man behind Richard III, the Duke of Buckingham, the one who might be very responsible for all this mischief. Because when you really think about it, the Duke of Buckingham had also lots to lose if the princes came to power. Here he was very much in favour with Richard III. He could be part of the government with Richard. And here I think it is even possible that he got rid of the two brothers without telling Richard III, which would mean that neither Richard III nor Margaret Beaufort were responsible for the death of the princes. But I really think that the Duke of Buckingham is behind it all. I really don't see how the two brothers would have escaped and not stay together, one going to the north, one going to the south. I really don't see how they would have escaped without help the Tower of London. So for me, the kind of theory of Matt Lewis, though could have happened, is not very compelling enough for me to believe it, because we don't have any evidence, but also because I think it would have been just too hard. You have to imagine that they had guards, and it was not easy to escape the Tower of London without an external help. So unless we find someone who had a reason to liberate them, which I think no one really did, it makes very little sense here. But the idea that Buckingham was behind it all is very compelling to me. For Nathen, Amin, he does not completely dismiss this idea, but he thinks that Richard must have known as well, and that's where I disagree. I think that Richard didn't necessarily know what was going to happen to his nephews, and I think that Richard III would have stopped the murder of 2 young boys. Because if you really look at his characteristic, if you really look at the person he was, it doesn't make a lot of sense for him to accept the murder of a 12-year-old, 9-year-old. And they were blood relatives, right? So I think here, I don't really see Richard III going that far. The truth is that it's still a mystery and we don't really know what happened. As I said, we lack evidence. What is very interesting is that in the early reports, including the one of Rochford, Philippe de Comines, a French politician, for de Comines, he wrote in his memoir around 1500 that he identified the Duke of Buckingham as the person who put the boys to death. And I think that was one of the biggest kind of theory that really marked, you know, the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century. This mystery of who really killed the 2 boys really impacted and shook Europe. Because if princes of royal blood could not be defended, could not be protected, what would it mean for anyone who was in power and who wanted to protect their sons and their dynasty? Richard III has been vilified for centuries after that. Many people have blamed Richard III for the death of his nephews. Robert Fabian, in his Chronicles of London, compiled about 30 years after the prince's disappearance, named Richard as the murderer. Thomas More, a Tudor loyalist, also wrote the history of King Richard III around 1513, and he identified Sir James Tyrrell as the murderer, acting on Richard's orders. But there is a point of vilifying Richard in order to make Henry VII look better and glorious, and to establish the Tudor dynasty. Here I think we should rely more on sources that didn't need to find a part. For example, the French sources where, like, you know, a Frenchman didn't really need to choose one side or the other, didn't really need to promote the Tudor dynasty. So for me, again, I think it's more compelling to believe that the Duke of Buckingham acted alone. Maybe Richard was feeling relieved, but I don't think that he gave the order. Thank you so much for watching this What the Elle in History video. Let me know what you think, and I'm going to put down below the links about the 3 amazing historians who are debating this very controversial topic about the princes in the Tower. I'm so grateful for your support, and I'll see you next time. Bye!